The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
The hallmark of the Jewish Living Podcast is highlighting practical issues related to Orthodox Judaism. And this week, we'll be discussing one of the most practical halachos that is not getting that much press, especially if you live outside of Israel. Many of us may not even be aware that this coming year is Shmitah, and while that may not have an immediate effect on most of the people living here in the States, we thought it would be a good idea to brush up on some of the issues you may not have had to think about for the last 7 years. That's why we invited on this week's guest.
Hi, my name is Rabbi Motty Rabinowitz. I am a Rav. I give shiurim here in Ramat Shemesh. I'm osek very much in medical halacha, choshen mishpat, but also halachos hatuyos ba'aretz, the halachos which is to do with Eretz Yisrael, especially this evening to do with Shmitah.
Rabbi Rabinowitz will take us through a brief overview of Shmitah and what it may mean for those of us here in Israel, or if we're able to go this year at some point, any of us visiting. So, Rabbi Rabinowitz, thank you so much for joining me this week all the way from Eretz Yisrael. We had a fun time scheduling this, especially with the time difference. And I truly appreciate you coming on to talk to us about a special halacha that is only relevant once every 7 years or so. And that's actually the second time we've done that. We did a Siyam Hashas thing, but now we're going to deal with Shmitah. It's kind of on the same cycle.
Well, that's 7.5 years.
Years.
Almost.
Yeah. So if you can give us, just first start off, a little bit of background information about you, how you got to Eretz Yisrael. Obviously, you sound American, so that probably wasn't where you started. And,
no.
And how you decided that this is a specific area that you wanted to focus on.
Absolutely, yes. So I actually grew up in the UK. You probably cannot tell from my accent, which is a bit of a mess at this point in my life. I grew up in the UK. My father was a Rav there. I went to school in the UK. When I finished high school, I made Aliyah at the ripe old age of 16. I made Aliyah by myself. And I went to Kerem Yavneh. I learned Kerem Yavneh for quite a few years, the army also. And then I went into Chinuch. Baruch Hashem, I've spent quite a few years, both in post-high school yeshivas and then also as a Rebbe in several high schools in the States. And I lived in the States for a while and came back here, Baruch Hashem, 5 years ago with a family. Eretz Yisrael is the love of my life in many ways, as are many other things. But Eretz Yisrael is definitely the love of my life. I've always been very interested in the halachos hatuyos ba'aretz, or the halachos to do with Eretz Yisrael, Shmitah, Trumas, Maasros, everything that's unique to living here. And I have my own yard, so now it becomes even more relevant now.
That's a rarity in Eretz Yisrael. Not everybody gets their own yard.
Well, yeah, it's true. And even if you do get a yard, you get like a 2 feet by 2 feet or something like that. But everyone has a mirpeset, so it's also relevant to mirpeset.
Okay, wow. So let's jump right into it. Let's get a little bit of a background. Like Shmitah is something that everybody has in the back of their mind that there is something. Obviously, for us in the States, it's not as relevant per se, but definitely for people in Eretz Yisrael, it is very relevant. And we can get maybe into American and Chutz La'aretz people, what they should know moving forward. But let's back it up a little bit. Let's start just with the very basics and a brief overview of Shmitah. And I'll let you take over from here. If there's anything specific that I want to jump in on, I will for sure jump in. But just do me a favor and take it away.
Sure, definitely will. So if we start off with where the Torah tells us in Pashas Bahar about Shmitah, that the Torah tells us that we're supposed to rest every seventh year. And this is one of those mitzvos that one really relevant, I wouldn't say not relevant, but one really kept for a long time in our Jewish history. If you think about it, the Beis HaMikdash, we just had Tisha B'Av, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed about 1950 years ago. And then there were Jews in Eretz Yisrael for a couple hundred years, times of Mishnah, but then everything dispersed and went all over the place. And as many of us come from Chutz La'aretz, I was speaking in English after all, so we know that everything moved abroad. And only recently, really only the past 100, 200 years, have these topics of Shmitah and Trumas and Maasros and things like that really come back to life as, Baruch Hashem, we've been able to come back and many people making Aliyah and doing the Nefesh B'Nefesh thing. And finally, we have so many people here and Shmitah and all these mitzvahs now become so relevant. So the Torah tells us we're supposed to rest, and the Rishonim commentaries speak about what's the purpose of resting during the seventh year. And just we'll take the main theme, which is for us to recognize that our parnasa, which if you lived in the times of Tanakh, probably not as relevant today, was people were agricultural. People had their own farms, their subsistence farming. So that was your parnasa. Your parnasa is in the hands of Hashem. 1 year you have to say, I'll let Hashem take care of it. It's all going to be okay. It's kind of funny coming out of COVID, or actually we're still in COVID, I guess, whatever wave we're up to at this point. It's kind of a lesson that perhaps we don't need to learn. We perhaps might not feel that we need to learn, but still, we have to let go a bit from our parnasa and recognize that Hashem is running the world, and that things have to stop a bit, and we just let Hashem feed our parnasa, literally and figuratively.
Right. So let's go into more practical things. What does Shmitah affect? And I guess, what are you allowed to do and what are you not allowed to do?
Great question. So the Torah specifies a couple of different halachos, midoraisa, a couple of main things that are forbidden, totally forbidden. So one of those is zriya. One of those is planting something, planting seeds, planting trees, bushes, anything like that, planting grass. So that's also from Torah. Harvesting fruits is also also min Torah, and also pruning. Pruning, it doesn't sound like it's a major thing, but pruning, if anyone has done pruning in the fall for their trees, for any plants that they have, the purpose of pruning is to promote growth. You cut down a certain percentage of your dead branches and things like that, and that promotes growth for the next year. So those are the things which are also min Torah. So that means, Torah-wise, essentially you cannot plant anything new. But then Chazal tell us that just like we have on Shabbos, we have avos and tolagos, we have things that are the primary melachos, and we have things which are, if you want, inflections of those. We also have in Shmitah, we have melachos d'Rabbanan that you're not allowed to do, which are not included in that. So for example, weeding, fertilizing, a lot of things that you usually do in maintenance of your yard, those are forbidden midrabbanan, rabbinically. But because they're only rabbinic, and this is the critical point, which we'll get into maybe a bit more now, because they're only rabbinic, those things are only prohibited when you are using them to promote growth, when you're using them to create new growth. When you're just maintaining what you have, so for example, let's take watering. Let's take something like watering. Watering, as we know, is on Shabbos, it's also to water your plants because that promotes growth. It's like a tolada, it's a subsection, if you want, of zriya, of planting something. It promotes growth. So on Shmitah, watering is also only midrabbanan, it's only rabbinic, but it's allowed when you're watering just to make sure your plants don't die. So you have your tulias, whatever you got in your backyard, and if you don't water them, they're gone. So you're allowed to water them to the extent that they won't die. But you're not allowed to water more than is necessary in order to promote further growth. So that's
if you have like a patch of grass, you should be able to cut that and trim it.
Right, exactly. So you're allowed to water grass that it won't die. You're not allowed to water it, so you get this lush, however high grass. Now, how do you know? That's really always the question with these things. How do you know how much water you can and cannot do? That's a tough question. That's why we have gardeners and landscapers to tell us how much.
My father is actually a retired landscaper, and actually, whenever we learned some sort of a topic in yeshiva that required a question of what is this plant? What is this? Like, my father would be the unofficial authority on what those things are. I'd have to go home with like a picture, like ask my father, all right, what is this thing? And then I have to bring back the answer. It was always a thing in my house. My siblings also. So we mentioned before, it's primarily for Yisrael, but is there some people that it affects more, some people that it affects less?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting. Again, in the past, probably you would think of, and when we think coming from Chutz La'aretz, who it affects, we think of farmers. Again, primarily we think of the farmers, people who have the kibbutzim and things like that. They have large fields or large orchards of fruits. And that's obviously going to affect what they can do. But nowadays, as we mentioned before, most people have their own apartments, have their own houses, whether they have an actual patch of ground, which we'll call the yard, or whether they have plants outside on their merpeset, on their porch. Most people have plants of some sort. So it's not just relevant to farmers, it's actually relevant to pretty much everyone who's living in Israel, has to think about how it affects them personally.
Right. All right. So we have this classic ability to kind of skirt the idea of Shmitah by making everything hefker. Can you talk a little bit about making all the fruits that you're growing, all of your plants hefker, and what that really means?
Well, actually, it's like sort of the other way around. Actually,
okay.
The Torah tells us that we have to make all our fruits hefker So part of, as we mentioned before, part of the point of Shmitah is that we relinquish our control over what we think is ours, and we let Hashem essentially take control of our lives, of our parnassas. So one of the mitzvahs of Shmitah is if you do have fruits growing or whatever it is growing in your yard, you're supposed to make it hefker. You're supposed to allow people to access your fruits if they have kedusha shvius, if they're things that grew during Shmitah. You're supposed to allow people to so if you have an orange tree, a lot of people around here in Ramat Beit Shemesh, which is where I live, a lot of people have lemon trees and peaches and oranges and who knows whatever else.
And these belong to people. They're not like just growing.
Yeah, in their yards. They're in their yards, exactly. So that if you have fruits which have grown during Shmitah, you're supposed to put up a sign and say, anyone who wants these fruits can come get them. They are hefker. Now, it doesn't mean you have to let people walk through your house at any times, 2 a.m. Sorry,
your house is not hefker.
Right, exactly. Your house is not hefker. Your yard is not hefker. Just the fruits are hefker. So you can say, put up a sign. All the fruits of this tree are hefker. Please call between these times if you would like to get them.
Can you pick
so that actually is the point.
Put them out into like a barrel in front of your house, saying these were the. Okay.
You could do that also. You could pick them and put them in a barrel, or you can let them pick them, whatever it might be. Yeah.
Okay. And before we move on to a couple of more specific issues, if you want to talk a little bit about Sfichin.
Sfichin. Oh, right. So Sfichin is a very interesting rabbinic enactment, takana, that was made because they discovered, and this is probably not so shocking, that not everyone was keeping Shmitah in the right way. So what do I mean by that? Shmitah only applies to things that grew during the 7th year. So for example, now we are in the summer and we haven't started Shmitah yet. And most people have in their yards have things that they planted Pesach time in the spring, and they planted things and they have things that are growing now. Most of those things are not Shmitah produce. They are what's known as Shana Shishis, the 6th-year produce, right, even if they happen to roll over a bit into September. So no problems there. The problem was that people were, and if things grow by themselves, you didn't do any malacha. So let's say you had seeds that fell from your tree and hey, you got a new tree. That shouldn't be a problem. You didn't do anything wrong there. There's nothing Shmitah forbidden about it. But what was happening was that people suddenly had vegetables growing in their yards during Shmitah, and people would say, hey, I didn't plant that. That was something that fell by itself. That's something somehow leftovers from last year, right? So Chazal basically enacted that anything that has 1 year growth, it's an annual growth, as 1 year growth, like a vegetable essentially, that grows during Shmitah, even if you didn't do anything, it's still usher. It's actually usher to eat it. That's called sfichin, because people were essentially faking it and saying that it was mutter produce when they actually planted it that year.
It sounds like the case of people having to wear masks even though they've been vaccinated.
Well, yeah, that one's a bit more visible, I guess. But yeah, people were faking it.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's get into more of the practical, everyday concepts that might affect people. So first of all, the thing that's going to be on everybody's mind when it comes to Shmitah, at least that shouldn't be everybody, on my mind at least, is people who you do this for a living. Farmers, supermarkets, people that use produce as part of their everyday how they get by. What are they doing during Shmitah?
So it's actually, I would divide it into two categories. You have the farmers, that's the most obvious category. You actually have landscapers, if your father was living in Israel. Right. So, landscapers, what do they do during Shmitah? And there's plenty of those around. So what do they do during Shmitah? So I'll start with the second category first. Okay. The landscapers, what they are doing right now is they are working, they don't have summer vacation. They have to get a boatload of work in before Rosh Hashanah. So they have, 6 weeks now? We're in the middle of Av. They have about 6 weeks now to do everything they need to do for people's yards before Shmitah. During Shmitah, they can do maintenance for things that will get destroyed if they don't do it. But before Shmitah, they are working very, very hard now. So hopefully they are making more parnasa now, so that covers them somewhat during Shmitah.
Let me just ask you, are there specific things that they have to do differently this year in preparation for Shmitah that they wouldn't have to do, let's say, last year?
Yes, there definitely are. But maybe let me answer the farmers and then come back to that. So farmers have a couple of different things they do. First of all, you might have seen many ads, I know in Mishpacha and many other magazines and probably in other places, for Keren Shvius. which is a organization that raises money for farmers that are keeping Shmitah properly, and they're not working the ground. So it raises funds for them to sort of get them through a Shmitah. I don't know. Obviously, that depends on us. Depends on how much we give towards these organizations, how successful they will be, and how much money the farmers will have. But that's one mode of essentially supporting the farmers during Shmitah. Another thing which is interesting, or maybe we'll discuss a bit later, is something called Otza Beis Din, which is essentially the Batei Dinim in the country take over the orchards and the fields from the farmers, and they manage them and distribute produce from them during Shmitah. So technically, you're not allowed to do business in Shmitah produce and things like that. However, it's they need the farmers. They need somebody to do the maintenance work, as we said. You're allowed to do maintenance work. They need the farmers to do the maintenance work. They need the farmers to rent out their tractors and who knows whatever else. So the farmers very often get some income coming in from sort of that maintenance work, right, which Beis Din has to use them for.
Let's go back to the landscapers.
Yes.
What was my question on that?
What do they have to do different this year than
right? What do landscapers have to do different? Yes, Manishtana Hashana has that for landscapers. What do landscapers have to do differently this year in preparation for Shmitah that they necessarily didn't have to do last year?
Absolutely. So we mentioned that you're not allowed to plant. You're not allowed to really do anything which is not necessary for the plants that you're allowed to do things that they will survive during Shmitah. So anything other than that, you have to do pre-Shmitah. So for example, you want to plant anything, that the cutoff date for planting fruit trees is actually on Tu B'Av, which is in 2 days' time.
Right.
So this is the last week for planting fruit trees, at least before Shmitah, so that the trees have time to essentially grow into the ground before Shmitah kicks in. So that is one halacha, for example.
That it's going to be 2 days' time from when we're talking, but by the time this airs, it'll be 2 days ago.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know that. So that's one thing that landscapers are doing. So anything which is not necessary for survival. So fertilizing. If you have fruit trees and you want to put down fertilizer for the fruit, you have to do that before Shmitah. So anything like that which is not essential for the fruit for your garden not to die, you have to do now before Shmitah, as opposed to regularly. You can obviously do that on an ongoing basis during the year.
Okay, so there are a couple of things. What about publicly owned land? And by publicly, I don't mean necessarily it's Hefker, but maybe the government owns it. How does that play into it? And does the Israeli government do anything differently for Shmitah?
Oh, a lot of good questions. Okay, so as far as public land, it really comes into a couple of different categories. First of all, in Israel, I guess you have that in the States somewhat, but in Israel, a lot of people live in apartment buildings.
Right.
So very often apartment buildings will have a apartment building yard at the bottom, and they'll have trees and bushes and things like that. So here you have it's not really publicly owned land, but it's a mutually owned land. So those apartment buildings also have to organize collectively, since they are the owners. They have to collectively organize and do all their collective work before Shmitah, etc. So that's one category. But then you get into the towns. So Ramat Beit Shemesh, Baruch Hashem, is a very, very pretty place. It's growing in leaps and bounds. Many people moving here, I'm sure this summer also. And there's lots of parks and there's lots of trees everywhere. So what happens to all of those during Shmitah? Do all the parks die? What happens to the maintenance of those? So, as we mentioned, there are things that you can do to keep the parks alive. You're allowed to water them to the extent that you need to. That will happen during Shmitah. But all the pruning and all the preparations, all the cutting back and everything you can think of is happening right now. So constantly, if you go around the streets, you'll see that there's piles of branches that they've been pruning back and everything. All the work is being done now before Shmitah. So even though usually you only prune in the fall, this year you're doing it much earlier to make sure that everything's ready for Shmitah. So that's what a lot of places are doing. I'm not sure everywhere. That's what a lot of places are doing. They're trying to preload the work for next year now during the summer.
Now, we spoke a lot about the outdoor yards, plants, and fields. Plants in my house. I have plants hanging in my kitchen. I'm sure some people in Eretz Yisrael do as well. What are the halachos regarding those? Are they any different?
So it's interesting. There's a couple of different categories in halacha, and anyone who's not any halachos Zraim will know there's a couple of different categories in halacha for plants in general. So you have things that grow in the ground themselves. So I think that's obvious that is covered in terms of Shmitah. That's Sadecha lo Sizra. That's the pasuk. It's your field, your yard, whatever it might be. The question is, what happens to things which are indoors? What happens to plants which are not in the ground? They are either on top of the ground, maybe they're hanging, from your kitchen ceiling, who knows, whatever you have there. So what happens to those? Are those considered to be plants which are forbidden in terms of halachos Shmitah? It says Sadecha, your field. They're not your field. There's something hanging off your ceiling. What is the story with that? So there's two different categories here. There's what we call an atzitz nakuv, which atzitz nakuv, it means a plant which has holes in it. And then you have something which is a atzitz eino nakuv, a plant that doesn't have any holes in it. A plant that has holes in it, and most plants usually do, you have them for drainage at the bottom, that, when you water, you have usually a plate or whatever it is underneath it to hold the water. So most plant pots have drainage at the bottom. Those are considered to be attached to the land, because ultimately, if you leave them for a while, you'll see the roots will actually grow out of the holes and they extend down to the ground. So atzitz nakuv is considered to be part of the land. Those fully have the halachos of Shmitah. Atzitz she'eino nakuv, if you have a plant pot that doesn't have holes in it, it's considered like a separate entity. It's not really in any way attached to the ground unless it's made of a material that's organically permeable, like wood or perhaps even earthenware. If it's plastic, which a lot of people have for their plant pots of plastic, then that's a separate entity. It's not considered attached to the ground. And if it's in your house, on top of that, it's in your house, which a house is not a field. This is a big discussion amongst the poskim. What happens if you have something which is indoors? Is that considered to be a part of Shmitah at all? Because Yerushalmi discusses this. So if it's something which is atzitz she'eino nakuv, meaning you have a plant pot with no holes inside your house, you can continue doing whatever you need to do during Shmitah. You don't have to worry about it. If it's something that has holes, it's on the ground, then you have to treat it like Shmitah, like Shmitah produce, Shmitah plants.
Okay, so just extending that, like here in New York, especially in New York City, there's a lot of these urban gardens.
Yes.
So these aren't necessarily things that are like in the ground. They're kind of on top of the ground, even though they're outdoors. They're sometimes on top of apartment buildings. I'm sure you have those in Eretz Yisrael also, where on top of apartment buildings, these things aren't in the ground, especially in Eretz Yisrael. The ground is so important. Is that considered something that
you're hitting all the good questions here? So this is actually a very, very interesting disagreement between Rosh Zalman Auerbach Zichrono Livracha and, if I'm not mistaken, the Chazon Ish, in terms of what happens if you live in a high floor. So let's say you have plant pots on your porch, on your, as you said, urban yard on the 10th floor somewhere. Is that considered like it's attached to the ground? I mean, it's on the 10th floor. You have air underneath your porch, let's say. So what is that considered attached? So there are those that are machmir. But Rosh Zalman Auerbach felt that once you're not on the ground floor, you can consider that to be atzitz she'eino nakuv. Essentially, even if you have holes in it, you have a gap between where you are on the ground. It's not attached to the ground, so that's already considered an atzitz she'eino nakuv. So if that's inside, you don't have to worry about Shmitah. Even if it's on the ground, if it's on holes. If it's
outside, if it's on the top.
If it's outside, you have to still worry about Shmitah.
And the last one I'll ask about. Okay, go ahead.
That's fine. That's fine. I don't want to get too complicated here. Also,
okay.
A lot of details.
The last one I'll ask you about is greenhouses. Is there any specific differences for a greenhouse versus, because that's indoors? I could have a greenhouse on the top of my apartment building, but generally a greenhouse probably isn't. But are there any specific halachos about a greenhouse?
Okay, so I'll go for a bit on a tangent here. So the answer is yes. That's the short answer. Now the long answer. This came up way back when. It's not that long ago with Gush Katif. So when Gush Katif was still in Gush Katif, so Gush Katif was famous for their greenhouses where they grew lots of vegetables, and they grew what's something which is known as hydroponics in English, and in Hebrew it's called matzah menutak, which means it's essentially growing things which are detached from the ground. You grow them on, I guess, in containers, sort of, on top of things, and it's inside a greenhouse. It's not in the ground. It's not anything. Totally detached. So the shaila was asked: it's a greenhouse? It's not in a field. It's a house, and it's detached from the ground, and the foliage isn't on top of the ground. All these different things. So is that okay during Shmitah? So this was something that went the rounds of poskim, and the poskim said it's okay, and that's one of the things which we'll get to probably soon. One of the ways we actually have produce during Shmitah, one of the many ways, is through what's known as this hydroponics, which is growing in greenhouses, growing things which are not on the ground, are detached from the ground in a greenhouse. It's not considered to be, according to a lot of poskim, it's not considered to be regular growth. And therefore, you are allowed to, it doesn't have Shmitah, the halachos of Shmitah on it.
Okay.
So, great question.
Oh, thanks. Before we move on, I have one more question regarding who can work on the ground. Let's say, so we spoke about the farmers.
Yes.
A lot of farmers are going to have non-Jewish employees employed throughout the year. Is there anything different that these non-Jewish employees can or can't do? Is that any different during Shmitah than it was from before Shmitah?
So this is again complicated, but I'll try and whittle it down to the main point. There's a whole discussion which, if you look at the psukim, is a very interesting discussion as to what exactly is the prohibition of Shmitah. We said you're not allowed to plant, you're not allowed to really plow during Shmitah. So if you're not allowed to do those, what is the prohibition? Is a prohibition on the person? We want to get into yeshiva lingo. Is it on the gavra? Is it on the person? Or is the prohibition on the field? That your field should not be worked on during Shmitah. So that's really the question. So if you look at the psukim, it's actually two different psukim. One pasuk says, Sadecha lo sizra, you should not plant your field. It seems to imply that it's the prohibitions on you. On the other hand, it says, V'shavsa haaretz, the land should rest. That seems to imply that we don't care who's working the land,
right?
But your land should rest. So that's really what it boils down to. Generally, the consensus is that it has to be also that the land is resting. So you cannot pull a fast one and say, hey, I'm not working my yard. I'll go get, depending on which country you're in, whichever nationality you're going to get to work your land, because, hey, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing anything wrong. The guy's going to do it for me. No, your land has to rest. Your land has to shavsar. The land has to rest. It's yours. You're not allowed to let other people work on it.
All right, so let's go a different way. Is there, like we do on Pesach when we sell our chametz, can I sell my land to a non-Jew, have them work it for a year, and then buy it back later?
Yeah, that's what's known as heter mechira, and I think maybe we'll get to that when we deal with the different types of produce. But yes, this is one of the innovations, one of the famous discussions which has become very intense over the years as to whether one can do heter mechira, which is essentially selling one's land to, in Eretz Yisrael, obviously to Arabs, when it can sell one's land so that the land is now not mine, it's somebody else's, and now it can be worked. So maybe we'll get into a bit more detail soon on that.
A lot of people in America have homes in Eretz Yisrael. Maybe not necessarily that they have fields, but they have homes. Is there anything that
I would think most people don't have fields?
Most people don't have fields, but is there anything that they should keep in mind that they should know before? And I would throw out one thing that we mentioned earlier. If they have an apartment, their building might have to do some things if they own a field. Is there, and they might need to be a part of that. Is there anything else that they should know about that they might not be paying attention to? It's a summer that they're probably in America at this point, not heading back.
They might not even realize. Absolutely.
And they might not realize. So is there anything that people who own property in Eretz Yisrael should think about now?
Yeah. So to essentially extend what we spoke about before. So if you have an apartment and you're living in an apartment building which has a yard, so most apartments in Eretz Yisrael most apartment buildings have something which is known as a vad bayit, which is essentially the homeowners organization that takes care of maintenance of the building. So usually they will be discussing at this point in time what needs to be done before Shmitah for the yard. So one has to make sure that that's happening. But let's leave that out. Let's say you have your own yard in your apartment, you have your own mirpeset, you have things there. You have to make sure that you bring in a landscaper to do any work that needs to be done that cannot be done during Shmitah, obviously, to make sure everything is done before Rosh Hashanah. As I said, I think the landscapers and gardeners and whatever else are extremely busy this time of year. They're not taking summer vacation. I think they'll have enough of vacation next year. So that's definitely something you need to take care of beforehand. Just an interesting point. I received a shaila just last week from somebody who mentioned that they are buying an apartment right now. They're in the process of purchasing an apartment, actually here in Ramat Beit Shemesh, and that apartment is going to have a yard. And they are probably going to take ownership sometime during Shmitah. Now, usually, before you take ownership, the kablan, the contractor, is going to bring in dirt. He's going to put down dirt in the yard. He's going to do a bit of work there. He's not going to do anything fancy, but he's going to do the preparations for a yard in there. Are you permitted to let the kablan, to let the contractor do that? So what I said to him was that I think, again, this is getting into Choshen Mishpat already, but I think that generally it's accepted that until you've paid all the money, your contractor will say usually, until you've paid everything, until you get the keys, the apartment is not technically yours. So that's probably not an issue if you're having work done before you've taken ownership. But yes, you're 100% right. Anyone who owns an apartment or a house who lives in Chutz Aretz, even though it's very distant, both physically and sort of mentally, you're not thinking, if you're in the Catskills, no one's thinking about, hey, what am I doing in my apartment? But you still have to remember that before Shmitah, make sure you bring somebody in to take care of what needs to be taken care of for Rosh Hashanah.
All right. Are you allowed to buy a piece of property that includes a yard during Shmitah?
No reason why not. No reason why not at all.
It's just the produce that comes from it.
Exactly. The only thing which is prohibited is doing malacha, doing work on it, and any produce that grows on it has the kedusha of Shmitah, but you have to be mafkir, you have to make it hefker for everyone. You're allowed to purchase, sure.
All right, let's jump back to the Heter Mechira because we mentioned it already, and I want to take a little bit of time to talk about it. So first of all, I think based on our conversation, we already figured out what a Heter Mechira is, but if you can give a little bit of a history about the Heter Mechira and what it entails and what it does not entail.
So I could probably speak for a whole week on this one, but
let's try 5 minutes.
Well, this whole book's written on this topic, but I'll try and again whittle it down historically and the pros and cons as much as I can. So about in the mid 19th century, when Jews were starting to come back to Eretz Yisrael, the students, the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov started coming back to Eretz Yisrael. So the issue came up where the Yishuv, what's known as the Yishuv Yashan, the Yishuv really didn't have any way of surviving produce-wise financially. The farmers who were starting up the new places, which you probably heard of, Zichron Yaakov and Rishon LeZion and all these places, I mean, they had no way of surviving during Shmitah. So there was no Keren Shvius at that time. So what were they going to do? So there was a whole discussion amongst the Gedolim, amongst the many poskim in Europe, whether we can come up with this new idea, which is let's sell the land to the Arabs, and then they can continue to be worked and produce can still be used, etc., during Shmitah. This was a very, very, very big discussion, very big argument between many of the poskim in Europe. So, for example, people like the Netziv from Volozhin was very much against this. The Aruch HaShulchan, the famous people were very much against it. But there were a lot of proponents also. And they said because the issue of the people moving to Israel in such dire financial straits, this is something we have to find a heter for based on many different things. This started in the 19th century, but as more and more people moved, you can imagine that the impetus for this obviously becomes larger and larger. The economic impact of Shmitah becomes greater and greater as you have more people to feed and more people living on the land. So as this continued, a lot of the people who are opposed to Heter Mechira allowed it sporadically. So, for example, the Rabbanim of Yerushalayim, Maharil Diskin or Shmuel Salant, were very much against. They felt that one should not. This is a tremendous opportunity to keep the mitzvah Shmitah. Why should we essentially circumvent the whole thing by selling land to the Arabs? So they did not want to use Heter Mechira, but there were 1 or 2 Shmitahs where they saw the situation was that bad that even they allowed it. The question then became, as the issue became more industrial, is it really necessary to still do that? And is it really, how halachic is it? There are a lot of issues with it, which we can discuss, pros and cons. I'll try and discuss very, very briefly if you would like. A couple of primary pros and cons here. So certain poskim halachic authorities felt that there's a problem of lo sechane, which means the Gemara tells us that we're moving back to Eretz Yisrael, we're living in Eretz Yisrael. It's because Hashem gave us the land. So there's an issur, there's a prohibition of selling land to non-Jews in Eretz Yisrael. So Chazon Ish, for example, very much promoted this concept of lo sechane, that there's a problem. You can't just sell land to Arabs in Eretz Yisrael. That defeats the whole purpose of what we're making aliyah for in a way, which is it's ours, we're living here. So we're selling half the country to an Arab. So that doesn't make any sense. So sort of that central idea, one of the reasons why the Chazon Ish was against it. Rav Kook, who was one of the proponents, famously, of Heter Mechira, he gave us a lot of reasoning why it might be okay. For example, he said that the prohibition of selling land to a goy in Eretz Yisrael basis on the Meiri, one of the Rishonim, is only if you sell it to a non-Jew who worships Avodah Zarah. So if you want to sell the land to a Hindu somewhere, that might be a problem. But if you're selling it to Yishmaelim, you're selling it to Arabs who we generally accept are not of the Avodah Zarah, they're monotheistic. So maybe that's not a prohibition of Sechanim. And again, this is a very large discussion. I don't know all the details. Two, I think, major points which are very relevant. One of them is how real is the sale? You mentioned before, for example, Mechiras Chametz, when we sell Chametz every year. This is a discussion which always comes up. How real is the sale when you're selling? Are you really selling half the land, half the country to an Arab? I mean, do you really mean it? Is that really true? Is it even legal? And one of the questions which came up, is it legal? In Israel, there's this backwards thing, backwards legalese, and there's a reason for it. Historically, before 1917, when the British took over during towards the end of the First World War, the people who were ruling here were the Ottomans, the Turks. So the Ottoman Empire had their own legal system. And one of the throwbacks to the Ottoman legal system is something which is known as the taboo. Taboo, actually. And it's not taboo, it's taboo. I have to pronounce that correctly because obviously that could mean something totally different. Something which is known as the taboo, which is essentially the land registry. So when you buy or sell land here, in order for it to be fully binding, it has to be registered in the sort of the official land registry. And that's not done. No one's doing that for half the country and registering it in Muhammad's name. No one is doing that. So is the whole sale fictional? Is it even legal?
Right.
So a lot of these questions have come up over time. Rabbi Yashiv was very against Heter Mechira for this reason. He said it's a joke. No one's taking this seriously. No one's really selling the land. And that's one reason, which is a very, very definite, gives us pause as to how serious it is. When we sell a chametz also, that's a big question. Right. How seriously are we really doing it? Are we really going to let the guy come in? I know certain Rabbanim have done this, where they'll knock on your door on Seder night and say, hey, Joe wants to come in and get some of his whiskey. How serious is it? Is it real? Is it a real sale? So that's one very, very big question. Which
so I'm wondering if there's a market for this type of a thing for like a large corporation overseas to say, you know what, we'll buy all of this stuff and we'll make it all legit. We will come in, we will go through all of the paperwork for you. We'll put all this on together. And then at the end of the year, you'll have to trust us that we're going to sell it back to you.
Well, that's part of the problem. Do you really, if it's a real sale, you can do a sale, in halacha, you can do a sale for a specific amount of time. You can say, I'm selling it for a year, for 2 years, whatever. So you could do that, contingency in your sale. But is it real? Like, are you really okay with the person taking it afterwards if you're doing a full sale? Right. That's really the question you have to ask out. But that's I think
the way that we do it, the way that at least somebody who used to sell chametz through used to do it when he sells chametz is that you would put the price tag on all of the chametz double of what it costs, what it actually is. Like, all right, if you want to buy this at the end, fine, but you're gonna have to pay me twice of what I'm asking for.
Yes, so I think that is done here. So to answer one of your previous questions, what the country does, the country actually has an official Heter Mechira, which the rabbinut, the chief rabbinate, takes care of, that they sell whoever wants, the kibbutzim, whatever official land the government has, or whatever the kibbutzim, the agricultural land. You don't have to sell other land, you don't have to sell office buildings, but the agricultural land is sold to a specific person they sell it to, and they put on the price, and it's a whole big thing they do every year, every Shmitah, that they sell a huge amount of land. Again, it's just a question of how serious that really is.
Exactly.
And they put some crazy price tag. The problem is you can never know whether someone from Abu Dhabi won't show up and actually pay the money at the end. So you have to be careful with these things.
Okay, so Shmitah is obviously coming up, that's why we're doing this. But as you mentioned earlier, or hinted to, different fruits, different fruits, different vegetables have different seasons. So let's talk a little bit about when we can start expecting different fruits and different vegetation to start really having an effect. Am I going to be able? When am I going to be going to the shuk and not
start worrying about it?
And it's different for different foods, obviously.
Correct. It's different for different foods. So I would divide this up into two categories. You have fruits which grow on a tree, what we classically call fruits. Those usually with trees, you water them sporadically. In Israel, for example, we only get water in the winter, as you know. So, you get watered in the winter. Some fruit trees, you don't even have to water much after that at all. So what determines the year, if you want, of the fruit, whether it's Shmitah or not, is determined when the fruit starts growing, when it buds, when it's essentially a third of the growth. When the fruit is, a small fruit already, that is what determines the year of the growth. So let's say you have fruits that started growing this spring. You have oranges, which started growing, a few months ago. So even though you're going to harvest them, you're going to get your oranges in the winter, which is the season here for oranges. Those are not going to have Kedusha Shvius. They're not going to be Shemitah produce because they really started growing. The formative growth was during the year before Shmitah. So you don't have to worry. Generally with fruits, you do not have Shmitah issues for a while because it has to be something that started growing. Its formative growth was during Shmitah. So you're usually talking towards the end of the Shmitah year when you start seeing fruits from trees that have Shmitah issues with them. So the beginning of the year, you don't have to worry about it. Vegetables are a different story. Vegetables are the type of things you constantly have to water. They constantly need your attention. So by vegetables, we determine what year it is by the time the growth is finished, by the time it's ready for picking, either being picked or ready for picking. So vegetables, you can already start having Shmitah, Kedusha Shvius, Shmitah questions already, Shmitah issues already straight away after Rosh Hashanah. Vegetables, you usually pick them fresh. Usually pick them, right at that time. So even a week or two after Rosh Hashanah, you can already start to have vegetables appearing in the market which have Kedusha Shvius, which are already Shvius.
Okay, are there difference between vegetables that grow above the ground and vegetables that grow in the ground?
Not that I know of. No, I think they're all the same category.
Okay.
They are the type of things that require more attention. So those are the type of things that what determines Shmitah is the end of their growth.
Sorry, and just for ease sake, vegetables that we're defining are hadama things.
Hadama, yes, hadama.
So where does banana, or are there bananas that grow in Israel at least?
There are bananas that grow in Israel. Where does banana fall into as far as Shmitah? That's a very good question. I'm not 100% sure about that.
Okay.
I have to look that up.
For those listening, ask your local Orthodox rabbi when you have to stop buying bananas that grow in Israel.
Yes, that's a very good question.
Okay.
Figure that out.
So I was in Eretz Yisrael for a year and a half when in yeshiva.
Yes.
One of the things that I used to do every Friday was go to the shuk and get something for Shabbos.
Yes.
Where am I getting my stuff? Like I'm gonna be, let's say I'm an American learning in Eretz Yisrael for a year, and it happens to be next year. Where am I getting my stuff? Or even the year afterwards, when the fruit also starts being a problem. Where am I getting my fruits from? Where am I getting my vegetables from?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different, actually more than a couple. There's 6 or 7 different ways you can get fruits and vegetables. It gets a bit complicated, but I'm going to sort of go through a list of different categories, and then you'll see how it applies in different areas. So the first thing, which is true in any country nowadays, with dealing with global commerce, first thing is that a lot of fruit and vegetables that we have don't actually grow where you are. They're imported from, if you're in the States, you import things from the Caribbean in the winter and who knows wherever else. Here also, even though Baruch Hashem in Eretz Yisrael, we have good weather and a lot of things grow here, but a lot of things that get imported. So during Shmitah, a lot more things are going to be imported. Obviously, if you're getting things imported from Turkey or from who knows wherever else, there's no issue of Shmitah for something that grow outside Israel. So that's the first category. And very often you'll see when you go to the shuk or you go to the stores or the supermarkets, you'll see a sign that says Miyuva Michutz Haaretz. It came from Chutz Haaretz. Means you don't have to worry about it at all.
But it also doesn't mean that it's going to be more expensive, just so people are.
Well, actually, so that's a very good question. No one really knows before Shmitah exactly what the prices are going to look like. It depends. Look, after a year of Corona, when the supply chains were totally all over the place, there's no guarantees for prices for anything anymore.
Right.
I know prices have gone up everywhere. So I'm not 100% sure. But usually when things are imported, they are a bit more expensive. Okay. That is the truth. But that's one category. Another category of fruits and vegetables are, we mentioned perhaps previously, or maybe we didn't, I don't remember, that Shmitah only applies to what is halachically considered to be Israel. And of course, what is halachically considered to be Israel is a whole discussion itself. 2 weeks ago, we're Parshas Vayischanan this week. So 2 weeks ago, we read Parshas Maseh, which are the boundaries, the halachic boundaries of Eretz Yisrael when Olei Mitzrayim, when people came out from Mitzrayim, they came into Eretz Yisrael. What were the halachic boundaries of Eretz Yisrael? So that's very relevant here also. You can geographically define what those boundaries are, and you can grow things outside of those boundaries. And hey presto, you have fruits and vegetables that are not problematic in terms of Shmitah, Trumas, Maisus, anything essentially. So this has been in every Shmitah cycle. It's a whole discussion. It's a whole, again, the book's written on this, but really the southern boundary of Eretz Yisrael is really the big question. Most authorities hold, for example, this might upset a few people, but most authorities hold that Eilat is not considered technically part of Eretz Yisrael. Eilat was not technically part of Eretz Yisrael. The one outlier is Rav Tuchachinsky, who felt that maybe it was. But generally, the consensus is that Eilat and the southern Arava, as the area as you drive down to Eilat, the sort of the bottom part of the Arava, the Negev, is not really technically part of Eretz Yisrael. There's a whole discussion whether you can go to Eilat. Is it considered like you're going to Chutz Eretz? There was a whole discussion in the 50s about whether you have to keep Yom Tov Sheni in Eilat. A very interesting discussion. I'm not going to go into that now, totally off topic. But just to show that it's not clear exactly where the boundary of the southern boundary of Israel is. So most hashgachos here allow, if not all, allow produce that is grown towards Eilat, the southern Arava, the kibbutzim that live there, to be considered not Eretz Yisrael produce. And they grow a lot of vegetables. They have a lot of greenhouses. You mentioned greenhouses before. And all that produce is not problematic at all. So they supply a lot of the vegetables in Israel during the winter. That's a second source. Category. Second category. A third category, which we already mentioned, was hydroponics. And there are some places, just like Gush Katif used to do, where they have extensive greenhouses, which are not just greenhouses, but matzam and tak, which means things are grown separate from the ground in the greenhouses and it's a whole big system. So those, according to a lot of authorities, are also do not have Kedusha Shmitah. They have no prohibitions, no restrictions on this. That's the third category. There's another category, which is Arab produce. So we were discussing Heter Mechira before, but if Arabs themselves, then even if you don't sell Jewish land to Arabs, they have their own fields, they have their own farms, so they produce produce, and their produce obviously goes into the markets in a regular year also. Now people are relying a lot more during Shmitah. People are going to be relying a lot more on Arab produce also, even though there's a big question mark over that halachically. Maybe I'll go into that just very quickly now. There's a whole discussion whether Arab produce still has the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. If Eretz Yisrael is Kadosh and there's Kedusha which affects the fruits, if the land is, farm X is owned by an Arab, does that mean any produce that they have does not have Kedusha Shvius? Or is it automatically the Kedusha goes bye-bye because it's owned by an Arab? Or do you say, no, it's land in Eretz Yisrael, it's fruit that grew in Eretz Yisrael. The fact that it happens to be owned by Ahmed and Muhammad, it doesn't make a difference. It still has Kedusha Shvius. So this was a very big disagreement about 5 centuries ago between the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Cairo in Tzfat, and the Mabit, who was a contemporary of his in Tzfat. A very big discussion which went on and has been going on for centuries, essentially, whether Arab produce has Kedusha Shvius or not. Most people in Eretz Yisrael assume it does not have Kedusha Shvius, in which case you're good. But the Chazon Ish and in Bnei Brak, they're very makbid. If you go shopping in Bnei Brak, it's very different going Shmitah if you go shopping for produce in Mirach than it is going shopping in Yerushalayim. In Bnei Brak, they won't use Arab produce so much during Shmitah. They hold it's no different from Jewish produce. It's Eretz Yisrael. It's, just because it's owned by Arabs.
Back to the question is if the Isser is on the owner or if it's on the land. Wouldn't that be, because if it's on the land, then it wouldn't matter if the Arabs own it.
Yeah, that's right. It's saying in terms of the malacha. Yeah, that's an interesting point. That is an interesting point. But they felt that even if you couldn't do the malacha, but any fruits which grow there still have, even if you couldn't do the malacha, the fruits themselves which grew still have Kedusha Shmitah because it's Eretz Yisrael.
Right.
It doesn't make a difference. It's Eretz Yisrael. So in Bnei Brak, they follow the Chazon Ish, who was the Rav of Bnei Brak 60, 70 years ago. And they hold that Arab produce is the same as Jewish produce. There's no difference. Has Kedusha Shvius. So therefore, they won't rely on Arab produce. Most of Israel relies on Arab produce. And therefore, a lot of supermarkets you will see, I would say that probably the primary produce you go to a firm supermarket will be either imported produce or Arab produce. Those are going to be the two primary sources. And obviously there's Heter Mechira, which is a whole different category.
Right. Okay. So is there one more category that you're going to
there's two more.
Two more. Go ahead.
Sorry. This is why it gets so complicated.
This is why
another category, as we mentioned, another category is Otza Beistin, we mentioned before. Mm-hmm. What Otza Beistin is, as we mentioned, is that instead of the Jewish farmer working the land, without going into the reasoning behind it and the sources behind it, that Beistin essentially takes over the land and says, it's not your land, you're not doing anything, it's hefker, but us as a Beistin, we are taking care of the produce for the community. For Aniyim, classically it was for poor people who didn't have any food during Shmitah. So Beistin would gather it up and just distribute it essentially for people who don't have what to eat. That's how it was classically. So nowadays, Beistin does the same thing. They essentially take over the management of producing, not so much producing, but harvesting and bringing all the fruit and produce to market. And they charge for that overhead. But they're not allowed to charge for the fruits themselves because the fruits are hefker. They charge for all the overhead, essentially all the manpower to bring the fruit, to get the fruit to market. And that's called Otza Beistin. And because that grew on Jewish land, that has Kedusha Shvius, that has regular halachos of Shvius. You only buy a small amount at a time. We'll discuss that perhaps in next time. So that is another form of fruits and vegetables that you can get during Shmitah, Otza Beistin. It's a bit more limited usually because depends what's growing in the field at that time. And finally, you have Heter Mechira, which we already
covered. Yes. Yeah. So again, this question is I'm asking it as an American, as someone who lives in Chutz La'aretz, sure. But it's a fair question for Israelis also. I'm not going to ask you to endorse any hashgachos because I know that's a whole separate thing. But if I'm going shopping, is there any specific markings that my regular hashgacha that I trust might add in so that I know that there's something different about this one that I could use it during Shmitah?
It's funny you bring that up. Yes, just yesterday or 2 days ago. So I'm giving shiurim right now on the halachos Shmitah, as many people here are, as we get ready for Shmitah. So I saw an article that last Shmitah, there were potato chips that were produced by the same company, I don't remember which company it was, produced potato chips in Israel, and they produced two different, same bag, same everything, two different types of potato chips. There was the Heter Mechira potato chips. So on the bottom of the bag, it said the potatoes were grown here in Israel, but they are Heter Mechira. And there was another bag of potato chips which had the Badatze the Chareibis on it, and it said these potato chips were made from potatoes that were imported. So yes, you will start seeing this coming year, both on produce which you buy in the supermarket, so snacks and whatever else. But more importantly, when you're buying fresh produce, you will look on top and you'll see what the source of that produce is. Is it Arab produce? Is it imported? Is it Heter Mechira? Is it Otza Beistin and things like that? So yeah, that is something which you have to look out for slowly more with vegetables, as we said in the beginning, but as you get through the year in terms of fruits and then wine and preserves, pickles and things like that. Obviously that's later on as these things get produced, you're going to see on the bottles of wine, it's Otza Beistin wine, it's whatever else it might be wine. You'll see specific labels indicating what type of produce it is.
All right. Well, since you mentioned wine, I'm gonna switch it to another alcohol because there's hard alcohol, whiskey, that could be sitting in barrels for a while. If that sits through Shmitah, is that a problem?
I'm not sure luckily, I'm not sure they make whiskey in Israel, so I don't have that problem. That's a whole problem in of itself in terms of, as you know, in terms of wine barrels and other kashrus issues. I'm not sure how relevant that specifically is to Israel.
Okay. All right. And the other one that I was going to ask you is, might people start seeing just even right after Rosh Hashanah signs saying this produce was grown from last year, so to buy that? Or
yes. So you will see that. You will see Yuvul. Yes. So again, in Israel, mostly in Hebrew, but you'll see signs when you're going to supermarkets will say this is Yuvul Shnat Shishit. This is from the 6th year. And also same thing when you get to not next year, but the year after, which is essentially the year post Shmitah. You'll still have a lot of Shmitah produce around,
right?
And you will see things which say Shnat Shvius or Shana Shminis, right? Things that grew after Shmitah. You'll see a lot of signs around. So yes, buyer beware is definitely true. When you get to Shmitah, you have to look at the labels and try and identify what category these fall into.
I do want to ask you one more thing, and this goes back to something you said right at the beginning, where this is a relatively, like in comparison to how long we've been doing other mitzvahs, a relatively new phenomenon. Now, I've noticed this. This is the second time I've done an episode on something like that. we ended up airing it, but I wanted to do an episode on shatnez, and shatnez was something that people weren't really keeping for a while, and then it took one man to come in and just, change how we view shatnez. And now everybody has their suits and new garments checked for shatnez before they wear it. Do you think there's another mitzvah out there that hasn't been tackled yet that may be something that somebody out there can go into and bring it back to relevancy, something that we haven't really considered in a while? So whether it be something like Shmitah or shatnez, is there something out there that kind of needs a reinvigoration?
So it's interesting. One of my I'm very much I'm Dayanos, and I deal with halachos and mishpat, and this is a totally different tangent than what we're dealing with right now.
Yes, it is.
But one of the things I think which is very relevant and totally off topic is and hasn't been dealt with is the rules of government. How is a government? How are we supposed to have ethical management? How are we supposed to rule a country? So the same idea is really a Shmitah. We had this huge gap in history of 15, 16, 1700 years where we never had any self-rule. Not that things were going so amazingly during Bai Sheni, if you read Josephus, but at least there was some semblance of self-rule. We knew what we were doing to a degree. But now we've been back in Eretz Yisrael for 100 years, and there have been Sfarim written, definitely Tzitz Eliezer, or there's a Waldenberg, or the whole Sefer Chus Medina. Certain Sfarim written, but there's definitely a huge field of how we're supposed to rule ourselves, how we're supposed to be, Ola Goyim, but also Ola Atzmeinu, how we're supposed to really be ethically managing our country, our organizations, our companies, and things like that. So I definitely think that's a major field that is ripe for
someone who wants to tackle it.
Time. Yes, tackle it. Yes.
Before I let you go, is there anything else you wanted to let us know about? Is there anything else that you think is important that we didn't cover yet?
I think what we did here, I think we get a very good summary, an initial summary for preparation for Shmitah, which I think is very important. Obviously, we are about 6 weeks away from Shmitah, and also sort of the highlights of all the different produce. I think we covered, most of that very well. And again, just to perhaps summarize, a lot of things to be taken care of now if you live in Israel before Shmitah, with your yard, with your plants, wherever they're hanging, with your building. So there's a lot of things to be done before Shmitah, but also just to get ready and then think about how you want to purchase produce. So just to end off with, we mentioned, I think it's 6 different ways you can get produce. And a lot of people now are deliberating, which one should they use? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, you have 6 options. What do you want to buy? Otza Basin specifically, do you want to use Heter Mechira? And one of the things which is coming up is, and there's organizations which are promoting this, Jewish farmers, and I think one of the initial questions that you asked, where Jewish farmers are really going to have a hard time with Parnasa. There's been money coming in from the site, from this and that. Do you want to try and support Jewish produce as opposed to Arab produce, for example? So there are people who will try and buy from all the 4 other ways, which is from the Arava, from Nirei Lat, and from hydroponics and other things, and they prefer not to buy Arab produce, not for any bad reasons, but because they want to support Jewish farmers who are keeping Shmitah. So there are organizations such as Otzar Haaretz, which is an organization which was started, I think, for about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, which will disseminate produce, and they will get the produce for you from Jewish sources, and they will give you the produce. There's a lot of organizations here that are trying to help the farmers get through the year, and also help people get the produce that they want, quality produce, hopefully, during Shmitah year. So please support all the farmers as much as you can.
All right, Rabbi Motty Rabinowitz, thank you so much for coming. Is there any way that people can reach out to you if they have questions, if they want to maybe bring you in as a speaker in their various Jewish organizations? Do you do that type of thing?
Yes, definitely. I'm definitely available by email and WhatsApp. I'm not sure if this is the forum to put that on.
If you would like to, sure, absolutely.
Yes, sure. I'm available by email at mottyrab, MOTTYRAB @gmail.com. It's probably the easiest way to reach me.
And if anybody wants Rabbi Rabinowitz's phone number to WhatsApp him, you could reach out to me specifically, and I will make sure that it's okay with Rabbi Rabinowitz, and then we'll forward it on. All right.
Sounds good.
All right, Rabbi Rabinowitz, thank you so much for joining me this week, and have a great rest of your year, and good luck next year.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you. You too.
My thanks to Rabbi Motty Rabinowitz for joining us this week. Our regular disclaimer holds true whenever we discuss any halacha on this show. Do not make your halachic decisions based on what you heard in a podcast. This show is meant to give a broad overview of how Shmitah may affect you in the coming year, but if you have any specific questions, it's always a good idea to consult your usual rabbinic authority. Until next time, Kol Tov.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Sreli Paikus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg. Follow us on Facebook at The Jewish Living Podcast and on Twitter and Instagram at Jewish_living. You can also email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queen's Jewish Link.